Intertwined. It was getting to that time of a night out when James had to make that difficult decision. Should he go out? He and some colleagues had gone for a few after-work drinks, a mix of males and females, since his other half had to stay an extra night in London due to work commitments. A 30-year-old man should be allowed to go out and enjoy himself on a Friday night, without a second thought. Especially when he doesn't have children to worry about. After a couple of hours into the evening, his colleagues began to drop like flies, which happened to be around the same time James decided he wanted to make a night of it. A decision that, in the past, James had never gone back against. Some workmates did promise to return later. They apparently wanted to shower and change out of their office clothes. James had used that same excuse himself in the past when he wanted an early night, so he wasn't going to throw all his eggs into the same basket. He wasn't too bothered about his body odor, so he organized a backup plan in the event his fellow workers failed to return. The fact that they were going home early bothered James since Heather persuaded everyone to go straight from work for drinks in the first place, because her 9-month contract was ending abruptly. And even more so, she had given James the impression that she had been having a great time. Yet she was the first to use the excuse that she needed to get out of her work attire. Heather and James had worked well together while she filled in for maternity cover. This showed tonight because she was pretty chatty and never far away from him. James wasn't looking forward to the previous accountant returning to the role. He thought Heather was much better qualified, and her input enabled him to be more productive for the company. So, with his colleagues leaving on short notice, James arranged for his hometown friends to join him in Glasgow's city centre. Another couple of hours had passed when James found himself in the same upbeat bar as he reached peak drunken debauchery. His friends had caught up quite quickly to his intoxicated level and were all now scattered around the bar. One was out in the smoking area, talking nonsense with random folk. One was getting cozy in the corner with a female he got chatting to at the bar, while the third had most likely disappeared back to the toilet to do more drugs, where he had probably found another fellow cocaine enthusiast. James found it odd how cocaine users felt the need to congregate with their own type whenever they were on a night out. It was as if sniffing white powder somehow automatically possessed them with more things in common than somebody they'd known since high school. Nonetheless, James was still having a great time. He knew after tonight that he still had 2 more days of the weekend to enjoy before the working week repeated itself all over again. In this given moment, he found himself enjoying something as simple as scouring the bar while watching how others partied the night away. That's how high he had managed to peak, that he wanted everybody else to be having a night as good as his. But it was during this time when James's night would take a slight deviation. He had spotted a recognizable face within the bar, but not too familiar. He didn't know this person, he only knew of them. So much so that James thought he had a clear picture of this person in his mind. He didn't have any ill thoughts against them, but he did have some unanswered questions that he felt he needed answers to. But that would be odd, wouldn't it? If he just went up there and introduced himself and began asking unrelated questions? Then there was Michelle. Would she be happy with him being friendly with her ex-husband? He was the one who divorced her, so she would likely take offense, even though Michelle rarely ever bad-mouthed her ex in that typical bitter way that most couples do after a separation. Maybe Michelle had purposely left details out about her marriage on purpose. The more he thought about it, the more curious he became. James couldn't help but sip his Morgans and Coke while he obsessively watched the man as he chatted with his friends. He was genuinely thinking about going over there to introduce himself. They clearly had something major in common, not to mention the fact that they were Eskimo brothers. A feint that not many men cared to know, as it meant they'd have to reveal they, too, have had sex with the same person. While all these matters floated around James's head, it was as if someone up there was trying to transpire something. Suddenly, the ex-husband shook hands with his friends before they all left him to drink his pint solo. If James was going to go over there, then this was his chance. Of course, if he had been sober, he wouldn't have had the audacity to do so. But he wasn't. So he strolled over to his partner's ex-husband. As soon as he got close to the man, James could tell that he knew exactly who James was by the expression on his face. And it was he who first introduced himself to James before James even had the chance to offer out a handshake. "James, isn't it?" he asked as James hesitated to respond. "I'm Dale. Nice to meet you." They both shook hands. James soon realized that he hadn't mentally prepared himself with what he would say to the man. He had questions but hadn't thought of the formalities of meeting a stranger. "How's Michelle?" Dale asked as he made sure to avoid any awkward silences. "Yeah, she's doing well. She's been busy in London, speaking at a marketing convention." "Marketing?" Dale asked confusedly. She wanted a change from recruitment. Dale shook his head. "Do you know how long I had been telling her to change careers?" Glad she finally listened. James smiled at Dale. He knew exactly what he meant. "I wouldn't let that bother you," added James. "She never listens to me either. Make sure you tell Michelle that I'm happy for her," Dale requested. "I will do." "It used to drive me crazy when I told her something," Dale vented. "Then a few days later, I'd mention it again, but she'd be like, 'What are you talking about? You never told me this.'" James laughed. "She does the exact thing to me, too." "Does she ever slag me off?" Dale asked, smiling. It appeared that it wasn't just James who had questions. James paused to think before answering. "No, not really. We both shared our life stories with one another when we first met. But she honestly didn't say anything bad about you. I remember thinking perhaps there was more to the breakup." Dale glared at James. "Like what?" "I don't know. Weren't you both together for about 10 years but got divorced only after 6 months?" Dale nodded while James stared at him with a perplexed look on his face. "You haven't asked Michelle the same question?" Dale asked. "I probably did back when we first met, but I think she changed the subject." "And what do you think?" "Me," James said, astonished. "Well, I guess it could be many things. Maybe Michelle was cheating on you, or—" "So trust wasn't the issue?" James pinpointed. "All marriages have ups and downs, but when there are only downs, then you know it's time to leave." James's face turned blank as he sipped his glass of whiskey. "So it made me ask myself if I was willing to spend another year with this person after wasting 10 with them." James gazed and nodded at Dale. "But what about the sex? Was that at least good?" James asked, boldly. Dale laughed as he took a drink from his pint of lager. "You want to talk about me having sex with your girlfriend?" James smiled while he felt a little awkward. "Michelle and I had a great sex life. She definitely knew her way around the bedroom," James stated as he happily nodded his head. James got excited. "Did she ever do that thing during sex to you with her hand while she—" "Oh, that," Dale said as his eyes lit up. "Yeah, she sure did. You can't teach that, by the way." James smiled as he raised his Morgans and Coke glass in the air. "To Michelle and that thing she does." Dale smiled as they clinked their drinks. "And to us," Dale added just as James was about to take another drink. "Eskimo brothers." They smiled again as they clinked their glasses again. "I can't believe it's been over 3 years since Michelle and I separated." "Time flies." James didn't respond. He suddenly froze with an overwhelming feeling that something wasn't quite right. Instead, he went silent while he began to do the math inside his head. Michelle was having a moment in front of a large communal mirror inside the lush ladies' toilet. A moment of doubt. Was she making a mistake? Before she could give an answer to her conscience, she became distracted. As she stared at her reflection, she realized she looked absolutely amazing. She was purposely dressed to be noticed in a tight-fit blue ink dress. No wonder she had a tough decision to make tonight. She hadn't looked this good since before she got married. But the moment she said the words "I do," she stopped taking care of herself. 2 stone later and a divorce to her name, she had lost her inner belief. Even when she met James, she didn't have this same level of confidence. Michelle was thankful to meet James, especially after he helped her get over her ex. But she sometimes questioned whether she should have remained single to see how it could have played out. All these online relationship gurus told her that she should never get involved with the first person she slept with after a breakup. Instead, Michelle was advised to sleep with someone the complete opposite of her type. But before she could, James came along. They met at a wedding in Jersey, an island off of France. It was inside an old Nazi tunnel, now a tourist attraction, where they first became acquainted. They had coincidentally booked up longer trips compared to the rest of the wedding attendees. They wanted to make it more of a holiday to explore the island. Michelle had finally felt rejuvenated with independence. She had clung to her ex-husband her whole life, making his hobbies and interests also hers. After getting to know one another, James and Michelle spent the rest of the day visiting further tourist spots on the island before ending the evening with a romantic dinner, leading to their first kiss. They both played it cool at the wedding, while secretly hoping to continue where they had previously left off. But sadly, it didn't work out that way. James returned home to Glasgow, while Michelle still had a few days to herself on the island. But she couldn't enjoy the remainder of her holiday, as all she could think about was James. A year later, they were living together. Michelle had a new flourishing career while slimming down to her pre-marriage body. Even after achieving all these things, she still found herself in the ladies' bathroom of a piano bar. And not only that, but why did she tell James she had to stay an extra night in London when she was clearly back in Glasgow? It hadn't been easy for Michelle to get to where she was. After separating from her high school sweetheart, she quickly hit rock bottom. If it wasn't already a hard time for Michelle, she soon realized she was all alone with zero support from her troubled family. Just as Michelle's marriage had collapsed, her parents had only agreed to settle their year-long divorce. Their bitter separation meant Michelle and her siblings were forced to pick a side, while Michelle had to grapple with her own guilty conscience. Michelle realized later that she had aided her father in hiding money from her mother. Her mother's long-term affair with a family friend embroiled the troubles within the family. So when she finally got caught by her husband, they both agreed to stay together for the sake of the family. Shortly after this decision, her father transferred large amounts of money into Michelle's bank account. She didn't think much of it at the time, but when her parents later retracted their decision to stay together, it was only then that she managed to piece it all together. Michelle had this hanging over her head while she was looking for somewhere to live. She couldn't live with her mother without coming clean about the money. And then there was her father, who had surprisingly moved on with another woman. During this time of living in a small rented one-bedroom apartment, Michelle had to be signed off from work due to depression. Her life suddenly halted. She didn't want to be one of those people who depended on alcohol to get through a tough time. She was already distant from her family when she also began shutting her friends out. With no work to distract her, Michelle soon found herself with insomnia. Due to a lack of sleep, Michelle soon had a lot of time on her hands when she discovered a distraction to her lonely life, internet pornography. When she realized she was spending way too much time watching it, she began weaning herself into viewing it at night only. She began downloading videos and storing them in titled folders. Couples who kiss a lot, hairy privates, small penises, and Michelle's personal favorite, the girl next door, since she and her husband grew up living next door to one another. When her attempts at weaning her porn sessions failed, and she discovered she had spent an entire day watching and downloading porn, she knew she had a problem. So she voluntarily walked into a hospital specializing in insomnia, where she kindly asked for help. It would be 6 months before she could finally walk out those hospital doors with her head held high. Michelle exited the ladies' toilet, leaving her conscience and those annoying doubts behind her. She had been looking forward to this night all week, and not only that, but it had become the ideal distraction to having to think about how she would have to get up on stage in front of hundreds of people to talk about marketing strategies. As she walked through the piano bar, she began dancing along to the music. She wasn't a Michael Bublé fan, but at that moment, she could feel every line of his lyrics. As she danced like no one was watching, she caught him admiring her. It made her feel special. She returned to the cubicle where she had been enjoying drinks with the same guy who had just been enjoying her wild, out-of-sync dance moves. That guy was Fraser. Michelle and Fraser went way back. They briefly worked together in their early 20s while Michelle was in a relationship. However, when Michelle and her future husband briefly separated, she and Fraser became close, but not close enough. Within a few weeks, Michelle and her future husband were back on. She actually thought about Fraser when she separated from her husband and what might have been. So when Michelle just so happened to bump into Fraser last week during her lunch break, she suddenly felt like she was 18 again. Maybe she thought history was repeating itself and wanted to be on the winning side this time. It wasn't until after she asked for his phone number that she realized her true intentions. Michelle and Fraser texted each other the entire time she had been down in London. Before she knew it, she had lied to James about staying an additional night in London when she had booked a hotel room in Glasgow. She even managed to talk herself into believing she wasn't in the wrong and that this was all James's fault. Why should she have to bite her tongue because she's too polite to tell him that she didn't care what Heather had said or did that day at work? Heather this and Heather that. She felt like all James wanted to talk about was this Heather. Of course, Michelle had to go snooping on Instagram to find out what this Heather woman actually looked like. And it was just her luck that this Heather also happened to look like a slut, which meant she wasn't to be trusted. Michelle had already been in this movie before, and it didn't end well for her. She refused to be that paranoid partner again, and with Fraser, she now had the power to change the ending to her own movie. From the moment Michelle and Fraser entered the Glasgow hotel room, they couldn't keep their hands off one another as they passionately kissed. It wasn't long before they kissed on the hotel bed. Fraser removed all of Michelle's clothes, and then he proceeded to tease her by stopping right before she reached a climax. He gave her a cheeky smile as they went back to kissing, and then Michelle demanded that he also get naked. She sat her naked body against the headboard as she watched Fraser jump out of bed and remove his clothes with his back to Michelle. He took his wallet with him to the end of the room, where he disclosed a fresh condom. Michelle had a thing about watching men put condoms on. It normally gave her those fluttery feelings inside her vagina. But with Fraser, it had the complete opposite effect. First of all, he still purposely had his back to Michelle as he rolled the condom on his manhood. But what he hadn't realized was the hotel room mirror was right in front of him. That feeling of guilt unexpectedly crept into Michelle's conscience during that moment. Was it because she was genuinely in love with James? Or was it because of how small Fraser's penis was, and the realization of a downgrade? Before she could dwell on it any longer, she found herself doing nothing as Fraser swiftly slipped his condom-covered baby penis inside of her. Within minutes, Michelle's lustful night of deceit was over. And just as quick as the sex had felt, Fraser swiftly jumped out of bed and rushed off to the bathroom, while grabbing his underwear from the hotel floor. Michelle lay naked and still on top of the hotel bed. She always wondered how this moment would feel when her ex cheated on her. She thought this evening was what she needed to take her to the next level in her life, from being rock bottom in a hospital to the very top. She wanted to know how it felt to be the dominant partner. But before Fraser's sperm could cool down, Michelle was back defending her actions. Again, she pointed accusations towards James and whether he was sleeping with his colleague. She awkwardly untucked the typically tight-fitted hotel bedsheets from under her before covering her naked body with them. As she rolled onto her side, she noticed her phone lying on the floor next to the bed. What if James had tried to contact her? She couldn't remember the last time she had even looked at her phone. She quickly reached out of bed and grabbed her phone before getting back under the covers. Her phone had zero communications from James. She couldn't work out whether that was a good or a bad thing. She knew her head shouldn't shut off unless she found some validation. It was now midnight, and James would be going to bed about now. Should she quickly call him while she had the chance? If James was to answer, then it probably meant he wasn't spending the evening with that slut from work. As she contemplated the idea, that numb feeling of regret inside her belly worsened. What if James somehow worked out that she wasn't alone? She could actually implement herself as a cheater. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to make that phone call. The second the taxi stopped outside the apartment building, Michelle immediately peered out towards the first-floor lounge window, where she spotted a light on. She paid the driver before rushing out of the taxi and into the apartment building. She made sure to be quiet as she opened the door to their apartment. She half expected a reaction from somebody as she stepped inside, but nothing. She examined the kitchen as she walked past it. Nothing out of the ordinary. She did the same with the living room, which wasn't messy. She didn't expect it to be since James was tidy. But the lamp that had been left on was out of character, for James always made sure everything was switched off before bed. He had a thing about wasting energy. As Michelle tried to determine how it could have been left on, her eye caught sight of the closed bedroom door. Even before Michelle had reached for the door handle, she knew this was the moment she would catch him. Half of her was numb with pain, while the other half was excited. The only reason she had cheated on James was because of all those same telltale signs she noticed with her ex. The biggest clue was that he liked Heather's Instagram pictures. Heather's time with the company was ending, and she wasn't leaving without taking James with her. But this time, Michelle had prepared herself. She didn't feel as pathetic as the last time this happened to her when she caught her ex-husband at it 6 months into their failed marriage. To this day, Michelle still cringes when she reflects back to all those times she went to her ex's work functions, where she would go out of her comfort zone to get his colleagues to like her, while unbeknownst to her, they all knew her husband had been cheating behind her back with one of their colleagues. The thought chills every bone in her body. As her blood began to boil, she realized she didn't have anything to defend herself with. She went back into the kitchen when her eyes instantly caught sight of the set of knives in the wooden block. Michelle removed the biggest and sharpest one. The blade was surprisingly clean, so clean that Michelle could see the anger in her eyes within its reflection. Her reflection only spurred Michelle on even more as she watched a smirk appear across her face. With the kitchen knife in one hand, she slowly opened the bedroom door with the other. The room was dark, but Michelle immediately noticed the body shapes on top of the bed. The sight compelled her to freeze immediately. "I've got you now," she shouted as she switched the light one. Michelle's face went into a deep shock. She couldn't believe it. She had this déjà vu sick feeling burning away in her belly. Nobody in the room said a word. She stared at them while they stared back. She blinked, but there was no way she was dreaming or imagining this. It also didn't matter how many times she blinked. She couldn't unsee James and her ex-husband as they lay naked and entirely still, mid-69ing one another. No wonder both men said nothing.